Hello and welcome to the Moveworks Creator Studio weekly webinar. In today's session, we're going to go over how to do PTO requests in Workday using Moveworks Creator Studio. The upcoming use cases that we have for webinars are all going to involve Workday, but PTO bookings is my personal favorite. So we'll talk about setting up Workday PTO bookings with Creator Studio. We're going to go through what it looks like to set up a API wrapper in Python, referencing it, the Workday API a little bit, and then setting up our use case. And then we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end. So let's talk about booking PTO in Workday with Creator Studio. So first things first, what should this look like for an end user? So our expectation here is that end user should be able to talk to our Moveworks bot, and they should be able to say something along the lines of, I need to take time off. Are you able to help me with that? From there, we want Moveworks to be able to understand the natural language, be able to interpret, okay, this person is asking to submit a time off request, and then understand based off of that, we're going to need to ask for some specific information. So Workday requires us to have a time off plan. So there's concepts of time off plans that users are able to take. So that could be our corporate time off plan, or it could be we have sick leave, vacation, wellness time, employee time, etc. So we need to make sure we account for that. Obviously, the start of their PTO. The way that we're going to implement this and the way that Workday handles it is if we don't give a defined end date, it will be 1 day of PTO by default. So just that start day you've requested off. We'll also give them the option to add an end date so that they can request a block of time off. So what we're going to need to do here from a Workday API perspective is going to be able to query the time off details for the employee. So that's what's going to allow us to grab their time off plan and make sure that we understand who this worker is in Workday, which we're going to need to be able to properly submit the PTO request on their behalf. And then the action of actually requesting that time off. We need to ensure that the employee specifies all the information that we need, whether it be a 1 day PTO or multi-day PTO request, and that the time off request is actually sent. The conversation should look something like this. So the employee initiates by saying that they need to take some time off. We can confirm that the plan that they would like to select so that we can associate the plan's Workday ID with our request. And then once they select one, we can allow them to specify the end date comments, start time, and end time. So in this example, she asked for 2 days off, July 4th and 5th. We call our request time off plugin, and we book that time off for her in Workday. This is just submitting the request for time off. So her manager will still have to actually approve the time off, but we've submitted the request on her behalf without her actually having to go into Workday and manage the UI there. So for our demo today, I'm going to give a brief overview of building an API proxy. The reason that this is important is that depending on the complexity of a given API, we may need to build an API proxy. So that API proxy could be something that's written purely in code. So in today's example, we're going to be looking purely at a Python file that we've written to get the behavior that we need to make this use case function properly. But it could also be done in a org-wide tool such as Azure Power Automate, using AWS Lambda functions, or any iPaaS tool such as Workata. Once we have our proxy set up, we can create our Creator Studio connector configuration to that proxy, and then we can do our paths configuration, which will allow us to actually submit our time off request in our Moveworks bot. So let's jump from here. And let me change what I'm sharing. Okay. So first things first, we need to understand the API a little bit. So we have our Workday API. Our Workday API is going to make us generate an auth token or a refresh token whenever we need to authenticate into the instance. When we want to request time off for an employee, we're going to need to be able to provide some information about that employee. In the case of the Workday API, we actually need their worker ID. So every employee has a worker ID associated with them. So if we send this request, generate our access token, and then we send this, we can see that each employee has an ID. So when we actually go to request time off for an employee, we're going to need to be able to input this ID here. In our particular case, we are actually not going to leverage this through the worker ID. So there are two options here. One is if we're able to have Moveworks ingest user information from Workday, we can actually set that up in our user ingestion connector. So in the same way that Moveworks ingests information from your organizational systems like Active Directory, ServiceNow, Jira, etc., we can also ingest identity information from Workday. So we have a Workday setup guide and access requirements guide on our docs site. If you would be interested in setting up user ingestion for your Workday instance, you can step through that guide and reach out to your customer success team and ask that they have a customer success engineer set up that integration for you. That will allow you to pull the worker ID for a given worker dynamically and reference it directly within Creator Studio. In our example today, we're going to assume that we don't actually have that identity connector set up and that we're going to have to build our own logic for getting around this gap. Some organizations don't want their Workday information to be exposed to third parties, so we're going to be accounting for that in today's session. So how can we overcome this gap of needing the worker's ID when all that we have directly and natively in Creator Studio is the worker's email address? And how do we handle this step of having two calls where we have to get the time off information for the employee? So this includes what their eligible time off plans are. So recall in Workday, every employee has eligible time off plans. Generally, this is standard across all employees, but it could be customized on an employee basis or a team by team basis. So we're going to need to make sure that we're able to pull that information. Since we're doing multiple API calls to be able to coalesce all the information that we really want, the easiest thing to do here is to introduce an iPaaS tool or build a proxy. So again, in this case, we have built a proxy. And this is a rough template of what a proxy should look like in a basic example. So again, this could be implemented in many ways in many different tools, but if you're implementing it purely in code, we're going to want something that looks like this. So in this example, we're using Python and we're also using Fast API. Fast API allows us to expose our endpoints to the internet so that it can be accessible through Creator Studio. We're going to be using multiple base Python packages here to be able to parse the data and make the calls that we're going to need to be able to make. And then we have some classes established just for some of our common schema definitions here. So for our time off request, our worker query request, etc. The first thing that we're going to need to be able to do in something like this is grab the auth information. So we don't want any of the auth information to live directly in a Python script like this. So in this case, I have it saved in a separate configuration file that I'm then referencing and unpackaging here to be able to get the refresh token. We have some function get refresh token, which simulates the API call that we saw in Postman to allow us to get the refresh token so that we can authenticate into that instance. And then we have our URL templates for the calls that we're going to need to be able to make to get this to work successfully. So one of the calls that we're going to need to be able to make is our authentication call, making sure that we're able to get into the instance. And then we want to be able to have this endpoint allow users to request time off. So we'll authenticate into Workday using our access token, and then we're going to have a select statement in WQL or Workday query language to help get the worker details for the specific worker that's been submitted here. So we're transforming the API from Workday such that rather than having to directly input a worker ID, which we would need a Workday ingestion setup to be able to do, we can do it directly with their email. And this function transforms the user's email into their Workday ID to be able to allow us to submit that time off request. Here, we make sure that our endpoint is accessible, we authenticate, and we enumerate the worker data so that we have their ID and their position ID. Position ID is another field that's going to be required to actually submit the time off request in accordance with the Workday API. And then we're going to have our date objects, which are going to be selected and pulled in by the user when this is actually submitted as an API call. So going down here, the definition of our post endpoint is we have some endpoint workers, worker email time off, where when this is submitted, we are going to use the email that's provided to hit our request time off function. So we're going to transform that worker's email into a worker ID. We're going to grab their position information and their time off plans. And then we're going to make sure that we are actually able to submit the request based off of that information. So at a high level, all that we're really doing in this file is taking our Workday calls that are multi-step and require some concatenation of logic between steps and coalescing it all down into custom logic that we were able to write, and then exposing that logic so that Creator Studio is able to access it. So skipping the need to try and accommodate the Workday API directly in Creator Studio when making all these calls in series and then relating the information back to each other would be very, very difficult without coalescing it in a separate tool like this. So that's a high level of how this code works. We are currently in the process of publishing a detailed user guide for getting this set up on our developer site, and this code block will be included with that as well. So now that we have our proxy, we can ensure that we have a proper connector to that proxy. So in this case, I've already created it and I've named it Workday Webinar Connector. So our base URL, we're just using ngrok here. So this is our base URL. It would be whatever you configure it to be in your proxy. And in our case, the proxy itself has no authentication. You would want to give it some form of authentication, typically just something like basic auth or token auth, so that it's not publicly accessible on the internet because it has some business logic for your organization within it, right? So make sure that you have some level of authentication in it, but in this example, we don't really need it. So now that we have our connector set up and we have our proxy, we can go to create our use case. So because we may need to ask follow-up questions and because we're implementing a post request in our API, this is going to be a path in Creator Studio. We want to name the path name something explicit. So submit PTO. I'll actually even enumerate that paid time off requests. Allow employees to submit PTO requests within Workday using our API proxy. Actually, I'm going to remove that information because the natural language triggers that are prompted in the third section are based in large part on this path name and the short description here. So I just want it to be something that makes more sense as being end user facing. Okay. And now we're actually in our path designer. So in here, the user is going to trigger the flow. The triggering of the flow we'll define in the next section, but we're going to want it to be consistent with our examples. So our expectation is that a user is going to come in and say, I need time off, or ask how they can request time off. So our first response here is going to be to ask them a question, which is, what time off plan do you want to book through? So this just allows us to resolve in Workday, we need to associate a time off request with a time off plan. And this will allow us to resolve that. So in this case, I'm just going to give a simple example of a Moveworks time off plan. And then we'll just call this. Now I'm able to add follow-up bot actions dependent on the button that was selected. So right now we have Moveworks time off plan selected. So if I add a bot action here, it will be separate than any bot actions that I want to add if the user has selected other. So in the case that they select Moveworks time off plan, we'll want to ask a follow-up question. What is the start date of your PTO? So we have a couple different question types here. This one is date. So we're expecting a date input back. If we'll always read this state as an ISO 8601 formatted date. So no matter how it's inputted by the user, as long as we can translate it into an 8601 format, we will do so. If we're unable to translate it into that format, we'll give the user an alert saying, hey, I don't really understand the way that you have communicated your date to me. Can you give it to me in this format? The name of this is going to be how we're going to be able to reference it in our API call. So I'm going to make it a little simpler. I'm just going to make it start date. And then we're going to create that question. And then we'll ask a follow-up question. Do you want to specify? We'll allow them to specify additional information. So this will be multiple choice of yes, no. So if they say no, we're just going to want to execute our API request. So we're going to select our connector that we built to our proxy, and then we're going to have a defined endpoint path here. So our endpoint path in this case is going to be workers/email/time off. So in this section, what we're going to want to do is unpack the user who is requesting time off, unpack their email address. So this is what that would look like. So when we hit this endpoint, we need to supply the user's email address, who the request is for. So we can unpack it by hitting this user object in this double curly brace syntax, and then hitting this attribute under that user, which is their email address. So this will allow our API to determine, okay, for this request, I need to get the Workday ID for the user with this email address. And then I'm going to need to be able to actually submit time off for that user. In this particular case, because this is a test instance, my email is actually not present as a user in that instance. So I'm actually going to have to hard code this. But in an example where you have a live account and you want to validate this, the syntax that I just showed will work, and it will work across every user who would want to be able to access this. We're going to do a post here. We don't have any headers or query parameters, and then we're going to have a request body. So in this case, we don't have a defined end date from the user. So we're going to have a request body like this. Start date is going to be a reference to the start date that we got from the user previously. So the start date in most APIs are going to be in that ISO format that we talked about before. So we're unpacking that from what was given to us by the user, the time off ID. Ideally, we would also want this to be associated with the selection above. Because we're low on time, I just have it here. And then the comment. So we could give the user the ability to post the comment by asking them a follow-up question. Please add a comment to this PTO request or something to that effect. And then we'd be able to unpack that with the same syntax that we have above. Double curly braces comment. But in this case, again, because of our time constraint, I'm just going to have it in this format. So we're going to say submit. Okay. So I would be able to go through all these buttons to customize what the workflow should look like for every scenario that the user could pick. So I could add additional time off plans. I could allow them to select an end date for their PTO. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as is for now so that we can validate it. In the next section, we're going to refine the triggering. So this is when should this use case actually trigger for an end user who's speaking to Moveworks? So how can I submit a PTO request in Workday? We would want that to trigger. Where do I go in Workday to request time off? We'll skip that one. We'll say that should trigger. So we'll generate these utterances based off of the basic information in the conversation that you've designed, and then you could always input them manually. So we can have just any line that we think a user might leverage to request PTO, we can type in here, or we can use the ones that are naturally generated. And then if we ever see with our use case that we're having issues getting it to trigger as we expect, we could always come back in here and add more utterances to our triggering section. Since I'm just testing this, I'm only going to want to launch it to myself until I validate that it's working as expected. When we save a path configuration or any configuration in Creator Studio, it will take a couple minutes for it to propagate to our actual bot. So we're going to need to give that a minute there to be available for us. In the meantime, let's talk about how to learn more. We have on our Academy website a Creator Studio Developer Certification. The certification course has guided training modules that cover all the key concepts and learning objectives of Creator Studio. It also includes step-by-step videos detailing key use cases. At the end of it, you can take a multiple choice exam to gain a certification, which you can display on your LinkedIn. We also have our documentation and developer community. The Creator Studio developer community allows you to collaborate with other developers at other organizations who are also leveraging Creator Studio and building use cases. We have additional tutorials and guides here. So we have authentication guides for Creator Studio. We also have use case specific guides. So this one is one that we'll be publishing soon, again, with our proxy API code. We also have developer-oriented documentation. Thank you for joining, and tune in next week for additional Workday use cases. Thank you very much.